This month, we are looking at the topic of abortion. We don't go into this topic lightly because we recognise that unlike the previous 2 months of topics where we've looked at climate change and modern-day slavery, this subject is a lot closer to home for many people. We do not want people to come away from this feeling judged and in pain, and instead we want people to know how loved and valued they are. Regardless of the decisions that they've made, we do not condemn anyone. What we do want to do, however, is bring clarity and truth to this topic. Unlike modern-day slavery and climate change, it's unlikely that any one of us directly or through family and friends has had direct contact with those other topics. But abortion, it's hard nowadays for many of us not to have been affected in some way. Again, either ourselves directly or through those we love and care about. And so we want to handle this topic best as we can with love and sensitivity. That being said, we are going to be discussing the topic in some depth. And I'm going to be challenging some of the ways in which we as a society and as a church look at the issue and think about it, and challenge us to think differently. The basis for this is rooted in Jesus' words from Matthew. Jesus gives the 2 most important commandments. He says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength." When you love someone that much, it's impossible not to share their affections, their pains, and their concerns. What they care about should be what we care about. And in this case, if we love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, then what is on his heart should be on ours also. The second part of his command is this. He says, "Love your neighbour as yourself." Jesus intentionally goes out of his way to demonstrate that our neighbour is not someone who is in a neighbouring town or even just the person next door, but is someone who we might even see as an enemy, someone who might be an inconvenience or we might view as a lesser person. He goes so far as to highlight that as identifying someone from Samaria, a Samaritan, as our neighbour. To the first century Jew, that was a real test. Samaritans were considered lesser people because they had given up the covenant of their faith and had married other nations. Jews weren't even allowed to talk to Samaritans, let alone be in the same house as them or eat with them. So for Jesus to say, "They are your neighbour as well," is a challenge for the Jewish people to think of as people even who they wouldn't necessarily value as equally valued or treasured by God in the same way as they would themselves. And it's with that in mind that we want to go into this topic. When we're talking about abortion, there are always 2 parties involved. We need to be kind, loving, gracious, and understanding to anyone who has ever been in a situation who has felt like abortion is the only answer for them. We recognise that Jesus forgives and loves everyone, regardless of where they come from or what they've done. I recognise that as a man, I equally can't truly understand the situations that many women have found themselves in around the world, potentially victims of rape, abusive relationships, or where keeping a child would mean that they would be ostracised from their family or community. And I can't truly understand that. And I'm not going to try to. But what I do want to do is highlight another aspect of the argument, another voice in that argument, the voice of the unborn child. Throughout the Old Testament, notably as well in the Psalms, Isaiah and Jeremiah, God speaks about unborn children. He says to both Jeremiah and Isaiah, "I knew you in the womb. In the womb I even named you." Giving a name in Jewish culture is so important. It carries identity and purpose. What you named a child was who they would become. So we know from what God has said that when he creates a child, he's not just talking about when they're born, when they're outside of the womb. Even in the womb, he created them. As David says in the Psalms, you knitted me in my mother's womb. He created every single child. And what I want to encourage you to reflect on, firstly, is that every child, even in the womb, has an identity and a purpose that is God-given, and no one has the right to take that away. Our mission as the Life Church is to discover who God created you to be. That purpose and that who God created them to be starts in the womb. As God says, I called them even in their mother's womb. I gave them a name, gave them identity. So I want to look at how we can love our neighbour, even if that neighbour has no voice and is hidden because they're unborn. The reason abortion in the church is so tolerated is because of a fundamental lie. A lie that I believe that the enemy has used to great effect to confuse us and to take us away from the truth, with the aim and the heart of trying to be compassionate and loving, but where we miss the greater truth. Many Christians, when we approach the topic of abortion, we recognise and we feel uncomfortable with the idea of it, but we also want to affirm and support women, quite rightly too. But what that often leads us to say then is that actually we quiet down the voice of protest that defends the unborn child, and we say, please be empathetic and compassionate to the woman in her situation, which is understandable. It seems like the compassionate and loving thing to do, where we say, please don't make this any more difficult than it already is. But I want to expose the lie of the enemy here with an example, with a demonstration and a story. It's a story that may be a little bit extreme and might seem ridiculous, but I hope it will demonstrate the logic that we apply to the abortion argument that doesn't work anywhere else, and should highlight why we need to be rethinking our position as a church and how we go about doing this. In the news, often the media portrays refugees as being a real problem for countries, despite the fact that as Christians we're called to welcome the refugee, to be a good neighbour, to love, to support them, to value them, and to help them in whatever way we can. Often the media portrays them as people who are coming, taking jobs, taking resources and finances away from hard-working taxpayers. And so they might be seen as an inconvenience. They're certainly portrayed in that way for many nations, seen as a problem to be removed. We don't want to think about it. Usually the answer for them is put the problem somewhere else. But at no point would you ever then say the solution is clear. We need to kill all refugees. It's the solution. We can't afford it. It's going to potentially impact our future, our communities. We don't know how we'll cope. Do we have the infrastructure for it? The logical solution is to kill refugees. Of course not. That is a ridiculous, absurd, and a horrible notion to even consider. Why? Because they're humans. Because right from the outset, we recognise that no party is ever okay. It's never okay for any party to be killed at the expense of another party. It's not okay. What's more is that in that situation, if you had the government, say, telling refugees why they should be killed, you wouldn't then tell the refugees, please be quiet, be considerate. You don't understand the circumstances and the situation this is going to cause for the government. Please be sympathetic. You wouldn't try and silence that party whilst defending their right to live, their right to be heard. And yet with abortion, that's exactly what we do. In no other party, in no other area of society or culture would we tell a group that is at risk of death or being threatened with death to please be quiet because of how it would make those who are trying to kill them feel? That's the brute reality of it. But the reason why we don't see it in that way, but the reason why we don't understand or perceive it in that way, is because fundamentally, even in the church, we have failed to recognise, honour and respect the identity of children in the womb, those who are unborn. When it comes down to it, we're more comfortable with allocating them a lesser position, a lesser worth in the eyes of God, because ultimately they can be expendable if the circumstances are great enough or severe enough. Some Christians say, well, obviously in general circumstances we don't like abortion. It's not a great solution. But in extreme circumstances, I could understand why it's necessary. Again, apply that logic to another situation. Generally, we like refugees and it's okay. But in this case, it's really not an ideal fit. So the only option is violence. It doesn't work because fundamentally we recognise the other party as human and having intrinsic worth given by God. They were created, they were called by name. The purpose in me saying this is not trying to upset people, but trying to highlight the hypocrisy of our own logic, the hypocrisy of our own arguments when it comes to abortion, particularly within the church. Right now, if you're more offended at the fact that I'm challenging this subject and potentially comparing it to a refugee crisis than you are to the horrors of abortion, the reality that hundreds of thousands of children are being killed every year, then I think maybe the priority is in the wrong place. Our job is to love and to shout out and speak up for the most vulnerable in society. The most vulnerable doesn't stop just with the woman who is in a situation which is challenging and difficult. It also applies to the voice of a child who can't speak up for themselves. Because the reality is 100% of those children who are aborted never get a say, never get the chance to say what they think about it. They're never given an option. In the early church, particularly in Rome, the culture that we now see that underpins abortion still existed, in that children that were seen as weak or feeble or frail were left out on the streets to die. The early church responded to this because they recognised the intrinsic value of every human being, of every child. And they would wander the streets at night and collect children, collect the generations of children that had been left to die, bring them into their families, raise them as their own, love them, provide them with homes, and give them an opportunity to know a God who loves them passionately and who has called them by name and given them an identity and a purpose. My challenge to you is not how can we judge women who have chosen the route of abortion, because that's not going to do anyone any good. But how can we provide them with other options? How can we say to society, violence is never the answer? If the only solution to a problem that exists is to kill it or to use violence, then maybe that's not the solution that God intended. Maybe the solution lies with why Jesus gave his church to the world, to be his hands and his feet. How can we be a solution? Well, one, we can start praying. Only God can change the hearts and minds of a nation. We need to start praying and interceding for our nations, asking God to forgive us for what we have allowed to happen, but also allow him to change our hearts and minds as well as change the minds of people in society and show them that they're loved and that there's other options out there. And then also to ask God about ways in which we can maybe be part of that solution, through adoption or fostering, through supporting the systems that look after children more. All these things are options for us and things that I want us to consider. Hopefully you can join us in future weeks as we're going to discuss these topics in more depth, together with others as well, and look at some of the ways in which the church can respond to abortion. I want to leave you with this challenge. We are called to love our neighbour. I'm asking you to rethink who that neighbour can be and not limit it to people who are outside the womb only. God bless you and have a good week.